Chapter 12. Shit, Paul thought. Out of the corner of his eye he could just see his sleeve. He remembered that loathsome shade of navy blue, the shine of daily worn gabardine. Away to his right he could just make out one of the grinning faces. Demelza Horrocks, age about 11. It couldn't be, he told himself. Surely not even in his worst nightmare. And then the full impact of what Miss Hook had said hit him like a falling building. He'd been asleep. He'd been dreaming. But he was awake now. He'd been dreaming. "No!" he yelled. He tried to get up, but banged his knee on the underside of the desk and froze with the pain. That's not... The words died on his lips as the unspeakable truth ground itself into his mind. He said. "Sleeping in class," said Miss Hook, her voice full of savage delight. "How do you expect to learn anything if you can't even stay awake?" She shook her head. "I don't come in here every morning for the good of my health, you know. I come here to try, heaven help me, to ram knowledge into your thick head, teach you the things you're going to need to know in later life. One of these days, you're really going to wish you'd pay attention, and then it'll be too late. All right, on your feet, headmaster's office. Come on, don't just sit there. Move!" Paul's legs were wobbly and defective. It took him 3 goes to get out from behind the desk, and all the other kids were laughing at him. "Please, Miss Hook," he pleaded as he turned for the door. "What was today's lesson about?" Roar of laughter from the other kids, a cocktail of anger and contempt in Miss Hook's eyes. "The rest of the class," she said, "has been learning how to escape from a synthetic universe without accidentally finding yourself trapped into something even worse. But of course, you won't ever need to know that, will you? Headmaster's office, Carpenter, and no running in the corridor." He'd taken this walk so many times, he'd have known the way blindfolded. Down the passage, past the library, past the assembly hall, up the stairs, past the closed file store, but they'd shut it at the end of last term, bricked up the doorway, down the stairs, past the science labs, up 2 flights, turn left. He couldn't miss it. In a way, it reminded him of somewhere else, but that was just an illusion. At some stage last term, the rest of the class had learnt that all buildings are in fact the same building, made over and seen from slightly different angles, like a reused film set. But Paul had been gazing out of the window and so had missed it. Subconsciously, he therefore misrationalised. He must have modelled the floor plan of the fantasy office building in his dream on the school, just the sort of thing you do in dreams. And here he was. Theodorus Van Spee, head teacher. Do not enter until told to do so. Yeah. He knew the drill by now. He knocked, stood back, waited. No answer. So he'd just have to stand there and wait until the old git was ready for him. He hated that. Such a vivid dream. He could have sworn it was all real. But now he was awake, he could see how ridiculous it had been. Magic, for crying out loud. A whole bunch of grown-ups making their living doing magic right here in the late 20th century, and for a while back there he'd actually believed in it. How stupid could you get? What was he going to tell the head? No mileage whatsoever in trying to lie to Van Spee. He had this horrible knack of knowing exactly what you were thinking, what you'd just done, what you'd been just about to do. It simply wasn't fair. Sometimes Paul imagined he was living in a world that was made and run by Van Spee, the way nerdy kids built huge dioramas for their model railway layouts. So he'd have to tell him the truth. He'd fallen asleep in Miss Hook's class. He'd been having this really weird dream. No, he didn't want to tell anybody about that. It was too freaky. They'd drag him away and lock him up in a loony bin. But if he went in there and had to face Van Spee, trying to keep it a secret would be a complete waste of time. Van Spee would hook it out of his mind like a bogey. They'd come and take him away in a big white van, just like they'd come for Ricky in year 12 last month. I can't go in there, Paul thought desperately. I daren't. If I go in there, I'll never get free again. Not ever. In his dream, he had to stop thinking about it. Nothing but a bad dream. A nightmare. Dad said bad dreams were just because he'd eaten sweets and stuff just before he went to bed. But in his dream, this room would have been Professor Van Spee's office, and you weren't allowed in there unless you were told you could go in. "Next," said a voice from the other side of the study door. His hand was on the door handle. He paused, used his right hand to pry open the fingers of his left. Obviously there was no way of knowing just by sight or by feel or anything like that. A door is just a door. The fundamental things apply. When is a door not a door? Next, the voice repeated. It wasn't happy. Answer. It came at him like King Harold's arrow, so fast and straight and sudden that it could have taken his mind's eye out. Answer. A door isn't a door when it's one of those doors, the sort that seal up behind you and won't let you out again. And it hadn't been a dream, it had been real. Fine, but what was he supposed to do next? Even if it had been real, and he was a 22-year-old clerk in a magician's office in the city rather than an 11-year-old schoolboy, and this was indeed one of those doors leading to the place you couldn't go unless you were allowed to go there, and where you couldn't get back from ever, knowing all that was one thing, but what was he supposed to do about it? Miss Hook's words were still ringing in his ears. How to escape from a synthetic universe without accidentally finding yourself trapped in something even worse. One of these days, you're really going to wish you'd paid attention, and then it'll be too late. Well, since he'd been asleep and missed all that useful stuff, he was just going to have to figure it all out for himself, from first principles, as bloody usual. Rule 46, no mental swearing in the corridors, stay behind after school permanently. The best place to start, Paul resolved, would be not going through this particular door. Try another one instead. He looked around and saw a door that he couldn't remember having seen before. It was only a few yards down the corridor from the head study, and it was pink. Even so, he stood in front of it. Getting there had been awful, like squelching through thick mud, the sort that sucks your boots off and swallows them, but he was there now. He reached for the door handle. What do you think you're doing? He cringed. Mr. Tanner, the maths teacher, horribly strict and bitterly unfair, was standing next to him, looking just like a goblin out of a storybook. I was just about to go in there, sir. You can't go in there, Carpenter. Sorry, sir. Why not, sir? Because it's a girls' changing room. Bull, sir, and by the way, you don't exist. Mr. Tanner obligingly vanished, and Paul opened the door. It was indeed the girls' changing room, but it was empty, apart from a few battered old lockers and an ancient but familiar-looking fridge freezer. With a sigh of relief, Paul stepped over and pulled open the door. The light came on. What kept you? Asked the fridge. Don't start, Paul replied. All right, first, is it true? Is there really a great cow of heaven? The light blinked, which Paul assumed was a yes. Her name, said the fridge, is Adumla, just like I told you, but you wouldn't listen. Do you know who I am? Paul shook his head. At least, he added, I have a vague sort of idea, but I bet it's a long story, he said. So you better tell me later. Right now, I need to know some things. Please yourself. There may not be a later. There will be, Paul said firmly. Question 1. The next door down on the left, that's Van Spee's secret place, isn't it? The place only he can get into or out of. Agonising pause. Very good, said the fridge. Correct. When they came looking for him to punish him for his crime, he built it as a last hiding place, somewhere I could never find. I'd figured out how to break into his synthetic dimension. That was easy. But however hard I try, and believe me, this last 1400 years I've tried, I couldn't find that one small room. Oh, I know where it is. It's just a few yards down the corridor on the left, but I can't find it. Silence for a moment, as the fridge fought back its rage. Do you know why? Paul nodded. It needs a key, he said. And the key's not a bit of metal with a frilly end. It's a person. He took a deep breath, because if he was wrong, this was going to sound so stupid. It's me, isn't it? Long pause. Then the fridge seemed to shimmer, like heat haze on the road, until it turned into Mr. Lairtide's. Very good indeed, he said. I knew you had the right stuff, deep down inside where nobody but me could see it. That's quite right. You're the key, though there's a bit more to it than that, of course. Oh, Paul said. Right. It's a long story, Mr. Lairtides replied with a grin, and I'll be happy to tell you all about it later. But right now, I need you to open a door for me. Yes, Paul said. But there might not be a later. There will be. Mr. Lairtides looked at him. I promise. Paul looked back at him. On one level, the idea that he'd trust a partner in J.W. ever again was about as likely as a Swiss army invading America, and a very good level it was too, as far as Paul was concerned. But there was a look in Mr. Lairtide's eye, just a faint glow, as of something buried gleaming through, that was so different from anything he'd seen before that he could just about imagine himself believing in it. Not that it counted for much, given that Laertides was a self-confessed master of glamour and illusion. If he wanted to, he could have every US Coast Guard ship from Anchorage to San Francisco yelling into their radio sets, "This ways are coming, this ways are coming," and he'd said it himself. He needed Paul to do a job for him, a factor which in itself gave him the credibility of Bill Clinton trying to sell someone Mexico. And yet... "Why can't you do it?" Paul asked. "If I show you where it is?" "I know where it is," Mr. Laertides snapped. "I just can't find it, that's all. Come on, it's not exactly difficult, and it'll only take a moment of your time." He paused, calming himself down so obviously that he practically changed colour. "Or don't you want to save Ricky Wormtoad and Mr. Tanner's mother? I thought they were your friends." Bastard, Paul thought. "Ricky Wormtoad had drugged Sophie with the love filter stuff," he said. "He completely screwed up my life. How would I want to save him?" Curiously, Mr. Laertides found that extremely amusing. Why, indeed," he said. "But you do. Admit it. OK. It's not so much wanting to as feeling as you're obliged to. Conscience and all that malarkey. One of these days I might even find time to tell exactly why you feel under an obligation to him. But anyhow, let's forget about Ricky. Rosie Tanner now, she's your friend, right?" Paul looked away. "She had me killed," he said sullenly. "By goblins. Goblins jumping out of a cake, for crying out loud." "Yes, but you know she didn't mean anything by it. Come on, Paul, there's no point lying to me. I know exactly what you're thinking. You've got to save them. You don't have a choice. It's who you are. You're the hero, see?" "Balls," Paul replied, with feeling. "Yeah, absolutely not. Ever since you joined the firm, it's been one heroic deed after another. Saving lives, rescuing people, standing up to Countess Julie and the Fae. You're 20 times more of a hero than Ricky. He just does stuff for money. You can see the difference, can't you?" But Paul shook his head. "You're wrong about me," he said. "Surprising, really, a smart bloke like you. I'm not doing it. Go and find your own bloody door." "Good Lord," Mr. Laertides said softly. "You mean it, don't you? Even though it'll leave Ricky and Rosie stranded in there forever and ever." He frowned and then grinned. "It's because you're not sure, right? You can't figure out who's the real bad guy here, Theo Van Spee or yours truly. You think that if you open the door for me and I turn out to be the arch-villain or the Dark Lord or something, the universe will suddenly be knee-deep in the smelly stuff and it'll all be your fault. Yes?" Paul looked down at the ground. "Something like that," he mumbled. "You prat," Mr. Laertides said, but there was the faintest trace of pride in his voice, as if he'd been hoping that Paul would turn out to have the moral fibre to refuse. "All right, then. Here's the deal. Sophie drank the love filter, right? She's now inalienably besotted with you for ever and ever." "Apparently," Paul winced. "Don't they have tact where you come from?" "No, actually. Here's what I'm offering. If you open the door for me, I'll put it right. I'll take the love spell off Sophie, and I'll make her permanently immune to it. What do you reckon? Tempted?" It was one of those moments that made Paul realise that 9 times out of 10, life really is doing it on purpose. Suddenly, everything seemed to narrow down to a very small, tight place where 2 alternatives confronted him, and both of them meant losing the girl he loved. And without her, what was the point of anything? Without her, he'd have to go on being the same old Paul Carpenter, Cupid's Labrador, always running after the arrows and bringing them back in his mouth. He could see the rest of his life stretching away in front of him, the long dark road you have to walk when you've fallen asleep on the last bus home and ended up at the terminal. Being himself forever and ever. But that seemed to help, in a way, because if he gave up on himself as a bad job, there could only be one logical course of action. "Deal," he said. "Excellent." Mr. Laertides grinned like a suitcase unzipping on 3 sides. "You've always managed somehow to be a decent bloke. Half-witted, annoying, thick as a stack of railway sleepers. When the chips are down, you've always done the right thing. Hasn't done you much good, of course, but I'm proud of you anyway. Now then, lead the way." "Not so fast." Paul folded his arms. He meant it as a gesture of steely resolution, but he had a nasty feeling it just made him look as though he had an upset stomach. "First you sort out Sophie." "Already done," Mr. Laertides replied. Magic, he explained. And no, you can't go back and see for yourself because I haven't got the time or the energy to run a bus service across the interdimensional void. You'll just have to trust me. I thought you'd say that, Paul replied glumly. Sooner or later everybody says that to me, and I always do. Probably explains a lot about how I keep ending up getting comprehensively screwed. Ah, yes, Mr. Leartide said, but this time it's different. This time it's me saying it. That makes a difference, does it? Yes, it's the only difference between a lie and the truth, actually, and you can trust me on that too. Oh, well, in that case, Paul said, but apparently Mr. Leartides didn't do irony either. This way, just follow me, it's not far. Oh, I know where it is, Mr. Leartide said. After you, though, might as well do it properly, I guess. Out into the corridor, turn left. Paul walked a few yards and then stopped. It's around here somewhere, he said. Only I can't be more specific than that, because... No problem, Mr. Leartide said. He reached out with his left hand, and where the tips of his fingers touched the wall, they seemed to soak into it, like ink into blotting paper. They flowed, sideways and down, defining a thin black rectangle about the size and width of your average door frame. This is just a guess, and God forbid I should presume to lead the witness, but would it be sort of near here, perhaps? Warm? Burnt cinders, Paul replied. Now what? Mr. Leartides took a step back. The rectangle stayed where it was. After you, he said. Paul looked at him. You want me to go in first? Essential, Mr. Leartide said. The door won't open for me. Just give it a push and toddle in. There's a good lad. I'm not sure Paul didn't get any further, because Mr. Leartides booted him hard on the backside. He hit the wall bang in the middle of the rectangle and fell forward. He was home, which was ridiculous, because the house he was standing in no longer existed. When his parents moved to Florida, they'd sold the house that Paul had grown up in to a developer who'd razed it to the ground and built a block of flats. But here, apparently, he was again, kneeling on the living room rug, trying to figure out who just kicked him so hard. Paul stood up. Home, he thought. Not that I was ever desperately fond of the place. This must be symbolism or some such shit, in which case it probably doesn't matter too much that I'm wearing my shoes in the house. Unnaturally quiet. Back home, either the TV or the radio was on all the time, a permanent background drawn, like the voices of the Furies in his head. Other things were missing too. No smells. Furniture polish, air freshener, recently cooked cabbage, stale cigar smoke, elderly and evil-scented dog. Without them it couldn't really be home, in which case it was a construct, a set, contrived deliberately for his benefit by someone. No, he could be more precise than that. By Professor Van Spee, a password maybe. As soon as you came in here, it morphed into your own personal space, or more likely a defence mechanism. Whenever someone broke in, it turned itself into the environment in which the intruder felt most uncomfortable. That made rather more sense. It explained the school set Paul had just come from, too. What a particularly nasty mind the Professor had, to be sure. But it was a great comfort, practically overwhelming, to know that it wasn't actually real, and he wasn't about to be 13 again. He managed to put up with a lot recently, including death, but he wasn't sure he could have coped with another dose of adolescence. So, if it wasn't real... Hello? Paul called out. I'm here. Now what? Mr. Leartides materialised beside him, a shimmering column of black dots like a newspaper photograph, rapidly coagulating into apparent solidity. About time, he said. I was afraid you got lost or something. He looked around, practically quivering with excitement, like a dog about to be walked. So this is it, he said. I'm finally here. You have no idea what it's been like, waiting on the doorstep for 1,300 years and not being able to get in. I'm sure, Paul muttered. All right, where's Ricky Wormtoter and Mr. Tanner's mum? We're going to rescue them, remember? Mr. Leartides nodded. It's all right, I hadn't forgotten. And don't worry, as soon as I've nailed Theo Van Spee, they'll be sent straight back to real space. No messing. How many times have I got to tell you? Just trust me. I wish you wouldn't say that, Paul replied. It doesn't help. Oh, you, Mr. Leartides grinned. Anyhow, I can take it from here. You don't have to hang around if you don't want to. If you like, I can send you back right now. That got Paul's attention. You can? Of course. There's practically no limit to what I can do. Hadn't you figured that out by now? To think, he added. All this time you were keeping milk and old mouldy bits of cheese in me, and you never knew I was one of the 5 most powerful entities in the universe. You want to go back? I can send you straight to the photocopier room if you want. It's no trouble.
Why would I want to go there?
Another of those horrible grins. Because that's where your Sophie is right now. Cured, he added, back to normal, or as close as she ever gets to it. His eyes, composite like a spider's, now Paul came to think of it, twinkled. I don't want to spoil any surprises for you, but this would actually be rather a good time, and you've helped me out here rather a lot, so why shouldn't you get something out of it? Paul didn't say anything, but if he had movable ears like a cat, they'd have been flat on the sides of his head. He said exactly where he was. Fine, Mr. Lairtide said. You can stay here if you like. Makes no odds to me. Be good if you could stay back out of the way, just in case there's any crossfire. I can guarantee your safety about 96%, but beyond that, you're on your own. Make your mind up, one way or the other. I don't think I can wait any longer.
You don't want me here, do you? Paul said.
Mr. Lairtides looked away. Nothing personal, he said.
Fine, I'll stay.
Whatever. At your own risk, though. Mr. Lairtides closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Wish me luck, he said. Even I need it, you know. For the missing 4%, if you follow me. 96% is pretty good odds, but I like dealing with gilt-edged stone-cold certainties. Like, for example, the last time I housed this close to nailing Theo Van Spee. The odds were 99.6% in my favour, and that was 1,300 years ago. He took a step forward and then stopped as though he had bumped into an invisible wall. Word of advice for you, he said. Never believe in any god who reckons he's omnipotent. If the small print on the stem of the burning azaleas says guaranteed 99.78% omnipotent, you're probably okay. But not 100. There's no such thing.
Thank you, Paul said. I'll bear that in mind. Look, can we get this over with, please? Only all this standing about.
Fine, snapped Mr. Lairtides irritably. Here goes nothing, then. He moved very suddenly, like the place where the film's been badly edited and 5 or 6 frames been cut out. Before Paul knew what was happening, Mr. Lairtides had grabbed him, left hand covering his mouth, right hand digging a knife into his neck, almost but not quite hard enough to break the skin. Sorry about this, Mr. Lairtides whispered, but it's, you know, the old omelette egg causality nexus. Real bitch, but there you are.
Theo, he shouted, I know you're in here somewhere. If you make me do it, I'll snuff the kid. You know you can trust me on that, Theo.
A sigh. Quite a clear, audible noise. Disappointment, regret, contempt, annoyance. There's absolutely no need for violence, said Theo Van Spee, walking out of thin air as if he'd been standing behind a curtain. Just as you know that if you kill him, we will all be lost beyond any hope of recovery. Paul could feel Mr. Lairtides' shoulders shrug, an instinctive translation of the slight increase of pressure behind the knife point. Broader it's long to me, Theo, you know that. Which it to be? If you really do want 1,000 years of utter chaos, see the side of now. Van Spee laughed coldly. You have never begun to understand me, he said. No wonder you have failed so wretchedly up to this point. To hunt something, you have to understand it perfectly. But you are the sort of hunter who closes his eyes and shoots arrows into the forest at random. Eventually, you will hit something, but it will take you a very long time. Whatever, Theo. Right now I've got your nuts in a mole wrench. Whichever way you choose, I'll have you this time. All that's left is how much damage you want to do to the scenery, and that makes no odds as far as I'm concerned. Either way, your choice. You clown. Van Spee's voice was quiet and utterly contemptuous. You claim to be the guardian of all that is good in the universe, but you have the heart and soul of a policeman. Very well, we will let them fight it out. Will that satisfy you? A deep sigh from directly behind him. Paul could believe it was 1,300 years' worth of frustration drifting away into the air. Perfect, Theo. That'll do just fine. I've got mine right here. You got your 2 handy? As you know perfectly well. Van Spee lifted a finger, and that same curtain of invisibility lifted off Ricky Wormtorter and Mr. Tanner's mum. They stood quite still, but looming slightly, like heavily sedated elephants. And of course, he added, the weapons themselves. 2 bright flashes in the air. A sword and an axe landed on the floor with a clatter, like the loose, rolling hubcaps so dear to the hearts of film directors. Paul didn't need to look closely in order to know that the sword was a shiny brown colour with cute spirally silver patterns. Only it wasn't. More of a sort of dark, steely blue. "Sorted," said Mr. Lairtides. "No, fuck it. Where's she got to? Daft bloody tart. Heel!" He snapped his fingers, and Vicky materialised a couple of feet away from where Paul was standing. "There you are," he said. "What kept you?" "All right," Vicky snapped back. "I was drying my hair, actually. Came as quick as I could." "You were drying your hair. Anyhow," Mr. Lairtide said, "you're here now. Let's get this over and done with, Theo, before you figure out some other way of making trouble. You're a clever bloke, but you change your mind more often than a tart changes her knickers. Ready?" Van Spee shrugged. "Of course. And no cheating. Promise?" A mild click of the tongue rang from the professor. "Even now you willfully refuse to understand anything. All I wanted to do was prevent the fight. If that objective is lost to me, the outcome is a matter of complete indifference. In fact, I would prefer not to watch. I would rather read a book if that is acceptable to you." Mr. Lairtides laughed. "Sure," he said. "If you want to improve your mind, go ahead. It's the last chance you'll ever get." "Then I most assuredly shall not neglect it," Van Spee replied mildly. From his pocket he produced a tattered black paperback. He picked out a bookmark and began to read. "Heart and soul of a policeman, eh?" Mr. Lairtides muttered under his breath. "You're going to have a long, long time to regret saying that." "All right," he barked, letting go of Paul so that he stumbled forward. "Let's finish up, and then we can all go home, your majesties." Ricky came to life with a shudder, walked forward, stooped, and picked up the axe. He was staring at Paul as though there was nothing else visible in the room. You what?" Paul asked. "You and him," Mr. Lairtide said. "Fuck me, I was just trying to be polite. Oh, for pity's sake," he added. "You still haven't got it, have you?" "Is this necessary?" the professor said mildly, without looking up from his book. "All that is required is that they fight, not that they understand." "Wrong, smart-ass," Mr. Lairtide snapped back. "Got to know what they're fighting for, or it's not a fair reenactment. Motivation, see? All right," he went on. "Time for some introductions. In the blue corner, King Hring of Rogaland, armed with the two halves of the axe battle troll." Ricky Wormtorter smiled weakly. Mr. Tanner's mum, fierce expressionless, dropped a tiny curtsy. Old battle-axe, Paul thought. Viking humour was clearly no better than goblin humour, in fact marginally worse. And in the brown corner, that's you, Paul, sorry, King Hroar of Vestfold with Turfing. There was an interval, maybe 3/16 of a second, during which Paul just stood there thinking, what's the stupid git talking about? Then it hit him like a falling tree. Me, he said. You, Mr. Lairtides confirmed, after 1,400 years, so I guess you could call it a grudge match. Well, don't just stand there like a prune, get your sword. Like hell, Paul replied, with intense feeling. I'm not fighting any stupid duels. Mr. Lairtides nodded over his head to Vicky. She swept past Paul, snatched the sword up off the ground, and thrust the hilt end into his hand. He managed to grab hold of it just before it could slip through his fingers and skewer his foot. You're pathetic, you, Vicky hissed at him, and don't even think you're trying to throw a fight, because if you do... The sword bucked suddenly in his hand, wriggling like a live fish and sweeping round, nearly carving off his chin. Do I make myself clear? Crystal? Paul muttered anxiously. Only I'm not terribly good. Oh, for God's sake, Vicky sighed. That's the whole point. You don't need to be. Just don't drop me. Leave the whole thing to us. That's what we're here for. She's right, Mr. Lairtides confirmed. In fact, it's best if you don't try and participate at all. Just let Vicky here take control. Vicky, by the way, isn't short for Victoria. Huh? Victory, Vicky explained irritably. Now, can we please get started? Paul tried to step backwards, but something felt wrong. To be precise, wet. Stepping backwards, he was walking into water. Which is why they had their jewels on the small islands, came Mr. Lairtides' voice, now apparently far away in the distance. Mr. Lairtides himself was nowhere to be seen, nor were Vicky, Mr. Tanner's mum, nor the professor. Just Ricky, standing in front of Paul, very still. On a small island, the voice continued, There's not a lot of scope for creative running away. Means you either stand and fight or you drown, unless you're a really good swimmer, of course. Paul tried to move his feet, but they seemed singularly lacking in bones. He wobbled and had to use a sword to prop himself up. Ricky was apparently doing deep breathing exercises. At any rate, he seemed uncommonly reluctant to start the fight, which struck Paul as rather odd until he remembered the spectacle of his alter ego, Psycho Boy, only just failing to slice Ricky into pastrami. Except nothing. There was, of course, no way in hell that Paul could even begin to make sense of all this. But it was beginning to dawn on him that the vicious and extremely competent swordsman he'd watched earlier had, on some level at least, been himself. Mrs. Carpenter's little boy, the one who'd always been picked last when they chose teams at school. It was therefore quite possible that Ricky knew a lot more about what was going on here than Paul did himself. If Ricky was, dear God, scared of Paul, he was bound to have his reasons. Scared of him, scared of the sword. That at least struck him as reasonable. If he understood the living blade business correctly, he was there as little more than a sop to the laws of gravity, a hand for the sword to sit in while it did its stuff. Basically a base of operations for the loathsome thing, a man à terre. And hadn't someone told him at some stage that Vicky was Ricky's ex-wife? No wonder the poor bastard was sweating. Even so, there has to be a limit. There comes a point where the reasonable man, even if he's a born coward, has to draw the line against the insweeping tide of weirdness and say, "That's it. That's my lot. I will humour you no further." Paul had been killed by goblins, sent halfway across the country to look at trees, been patronised by fridges, framed for murder, stranded in an alternate universe apparently made out of custard, and forced to believe in the existence of the great cow of heaven. Participating further would simply be encouraging them, and he wasn't going to do it. He glanced over his shoulder at the calm blue sea behind him. Theo Van Spee had made it, and presumably controlled it, and Theo Van Spee didn't want the fight to happen. It was worth the risk, even if he wasn't what you'd call a human fish. Van Spee's synthetic ocean wouldn't let him drown. It was more than its job was worth. "Bye then," he called out to Ricky, who stepped back and winced. Then Paul dumped the sword. Getting rid of it was like ditching chewing gum. It really didn't want to leave his fingers, and ran down the beach into the water. Just for once, he reckoned as the sea welled up under him and took his weight. He'd guessed right. The water cushioned him like a lilo, and somehow each successive wave got out of the way of his face so it didn't get a mouthful of brine. He began to doggy paddle, and soon had enough way on him to tow a water-skiing Barbie doll. Screw Mr. Laertides and the rest of them, he thought. Somewhere all this wet stuff had to have a dry edge. All he had to do was keep on splashing about until he reached it. Elegant in its simplicity, though he said it himself. An arm shot out of the water 18 inches from his head. The shock made him flounder. He should have panicked and gone under, but the sea pushed him firmly back, like a mother trying to convince her toddler that the noisy, scary party was actually fun. The arm sliced through the water at him, shark's fin style. He tried to avoid it, but no dice. Its hand, he knew it from somewhere, grabbed itself a generous handful of his hair and yanked him back. "Yeah, oh!" Paul wailed, and then the sea fed him a mouthful of salt water, like an impatient mummy cuckoo feeding its young. The hand in his hair dragged harder, pulling him under with a level of force that was beyond the power of doggy paddle to resist. As the waves closed around him, he shut his eyes tight and breathed out through his nose to keep it from filling up with sea. "Say you're sorry," Vicky hissed. Never mess with a mermaid in a maritime context. Paul opened his mouth to comply, but it flooded before he could get further than Luckily, Vicky seemed happy with that and let go of his hair. He bobbed up, spitting out brine, and she punched him in the eye. That sort of broke Paul's concentration, and the world went rather vague for a while. When he came round, he was lying on the beach on his back, with Vicky leaning over him, looking worried. He looked up at her and groaned. "Context," he said. "I hate context." "What?" Think about it." Paul felt his jaw. Like a Bedford van, it wasn't perfect, but it worked. "I'm not allowed to leave, right?" Vicky nodded. "Now get up and fight," she said. "Or what? You'll hit me again?" "Yes." He grinned. "And if I do as I'm told, Ricky's going to kill me. Gosh, tricky one. I may have to think it over for a whole millisecond." "Don't be so feeble." She grabbed his wrist and yanked hard. Paul yelped and scrambled to his feet. As he did so, he noticed there was something sticking to his right heel. Automatically, he reached down and pulled it off. It was a dark green leather bookmark. Without thinking, he stuffed it in his trouser pocket. "Nice game plan," he grumbled. "Dislocate my sword arm, inspirational stuff. You should get one of those bloody hooded fleeces with coach on the back."
"For crying out loud, stop whining," Vicky replied. "And how many times have I got to tell you? Leave everything to us. Don't interfere and we'll be fine. We've been waiting 1,300 years for this, remember?"
"When you say we..." She stuck the sword in Paul's hand, closed his fingers around the hilt and shoved him in the small of the back. He stumbled forward, and by the time he'd got his balance back, he was standing no more than 3 feet away from the cutting edge of Ricky's axe. "Hello," Ricky said unhappily. "So here we are again." "Again?" Paul shook his head. "You may be. I'm not. Look, there's obviously been the most colossal balls up, but if you and I just chill for a moment, talk it over, sort it out like rational human beings..." Ricky swung at him with the horrible axe. Paul felt the edge, sharp as a needle, trace a line across his forehead. "Fuck!" he shouted. "That hurt!" But then his own arm jerked out straight, as if the sword was a huge, boisterous dog wanting to be walked, and he watched in horror as the cutting edge grazed Ricky's cheek, shaving a small patch of his designer stubble. "Jesus, sorry!" he gasped. I really didn't mean..." Ricky lunged. Paul felt himself sway out of the way. Actually, it was like being battered in the stomach with a large invisible pillow, and his annoyingly willful arm swished a fearful horizontal blow at Ricky's neck. Just as he thought he'd killed the poor bastard, Ricky's axe head got in the way, and there was a noisy clang of steel on steel. Paul tried to jump back out of the way. His body tried to obey, but his feet stayed planted. Fortuitously, his failed attempt coincided with a furious sweep from Ricky, which turned it into a perfectly judged, evasive manoeuvre. "Ricky!" he yelled. "Stop it! This is stupid!" "I can't!" Ricky grunted back, avoiding a murderous downward slash by the thickness of a cigarette paper. "It's not up to us, don't you see?" Paul saw all right, but there wasn't a lot he could do. Each time he tried to lower his sword, step back or turn around, Ricky's axe would dart past him, converting his move into an appropriate response. That, he couldn't help thinking, was insult to injury with insult sauce. Meanwhile, his poor abused arm was putting up one hell of a fight. Even Paul could tell it was hot stuff, and considerably better than the show Ricky was putting on. When Ricky was a fraction of a second late with a high parry and the edge of Paul's sword nicked his shoulder with a revolting chunky sticking sound, it was almost more than Paul could bear. Sure, he told himself, dying won't be fun. It'll be back to that horrible dark place with no walls or floor, and Mr. Dow's bridge club, and gradually fading away like the end of a song. But one of these days, sooner or later, he was going to die anyway. It was inevitable, and there was nothing he could do about that. Killing Ricky, on the other hand, was something he didn't have to do, not now or ever, and if there was any way he could avoid it, he would. Paul did his best. He tried letting go of the sword hilt, but it stuck to his hand like chewing gum on a shoe. He tried holding still when the sword wanted him to move, but the sword kept winning. He tried yelling out what he thought the sword was about to do so Ricky could dodge or parry or counterattack, but he didn't know nearly enough about sword fighting and just made things worse. He tried jamming his foot down on a large stone, hoping he'd turn his ankle over and go crashing to the ground, but all he succeeded in doing was kicking the stone into Ricky's face, nearly knocking him off his feet. It was hopeless. Any moment now, a cut or a thrust was going to get past Ricky's fragile-looking guard, and there was nothing Paul could do to stop it, because every deliberate mistake he made got forcibly converted into a brilliant defence or remorseless aggression. "It's not fair," he howled at himself. "The only time in my life I'm really good at something, and I don't want to be." And then, in the tiny interval between Ricky's feeble countercut and his own ruthless feint, leading inevitably to an opening in Ricky's guard on the left-hand side of his chest, Paul figured it out. The sword, it seemed, could predict his attempts to throw the fight and could transform him into winning moves. It didn't trust him, obviously, and was wise to the few half-baked ploys that made up his entire repertoire, itself a vague collage of images remembered from watching Mel Gibson in Braveheart, before he fell asleep halfway through. But what if he deliberately tried to win? Would the sword stop him and make him do the fight its way, or wasn't it devious enough for that? If he did nothing, Ricky would be dead meat in about 30 seconds. "Screw it," Paul muttered to himself, and launched an all-out attack on Ricky's head. He swung the sword and hacked as hard as he could. Just as he'd hoped, Ricky dodged the cut easily, then drew back his arm for the counterattack. About time too, Paul told himself, and waited for the sharp steel to slice into him. At least it will be quick, and then he'll have nothing to worry about apart from some dead guy trumping his best cards on a bit of 2 clubs redoubled. Ricky didn't attack. Instead, he stood there, his left hand clamped to his right wrist, his teeth gritted with strain. Dr. Strangelove with a huge meat cleaver. He was trying desperately to say something, but he couldn't get his mouth open wide enough to make himself understood. Paul was pretty sure it ended in un, but that was the best he could do. Fun? At any other time, maybe, but Ricky didn't look like he was enjoying himself much. Not gun, because they were both using more basic instrumentation. Was Ricky trying to tell him to pull his gun from his shoulder holster and blast him while he was still able to keep the sword from doing its stuff? Or bun, perhaps, referring to the poisoned custard slice. Sun, pun, none. For fuck's sake! Exploded from Ricky's mouth. Tun, spun, shun. My kingdom for a rhyming dictionary. Run. I can't, he whimpered. This fucking stupid sword won't let me. I wish I could, but... Ugh! Ricky said with feeling, as his right hand forced itself down 1/2 inch. Ow! Me too, Paul was about to say, but he figured out the context just in time. Here we go again, playing Scrabble in the jaws of death. Bill, fill, spill, mill, nil, kill. I can't, he whispered. Sorry. Ricky shrieked, as his left fingernails gouged out bloody furrows of skin from his right wrist. His eyes screwed shut. Paul could feel the unbearable pressure of Ricky's willpower concentrated on him, ordering him to stick the sword into his opponent's chest. Please. Well, it'd solve a lot of problems. No, couldn't be done. Paul couldn't send someone else down there where he'd been. He could feel his own arm dragging at its socket, the tendons ripping away from the bone, the muscles tearing, but it was still his arm, and he could make it do as it was told, because even magic couldn't achieve the impossible, and killing Ricky was, quite simply, something he was incapable of doing. A pity, really, because one of the two of them wasn't going home, and Miss Hook had managed to hammer enough basic arithmetic into Paul's skull to make the implications of that appallingly clear. If he couldn't kill Ricky, he himself was going to die in about 3 seconds. Tell Sophie I love her, Paul said. All right, she knows that, but tell her anyway. Oh yes, and could you see to it that someone picks up my grey suit from the dry cleaners and takes my library books back? That's about it, I think. Ricky sobbed, and his right hand tore free. Paul watched the blade come straight at him. Most of the way.